Hi, and welcome back to Plastic Models by Regular Dude and part 2 of Plastic Models for Beginners, Back to Basics with the Tamiya Grumman F4F-4 in 1/48 scale. So today we are going to begin construction of the kit. So let's turn this camera around and get started. Alright, I've got all the tools ready and all that stuff, and the first part to assemble is the fuselage. And for those of you who've watched my videos in the past, when it comes to cleaning up and a lot of the more mundane and monotonous things, I tend to skip over that stuff and not really deal with it. But since this is a back to basics and beginner thing, I am going to show a lot of that. So the first thing, in cutting off the fuselage parts from the sprue, using my good cutter, I'm cutting it quite a ways away from the actual parts themselves. And the reason I'm doing that is so I can show how I try and clean these things up. So first thing I'm going to do, quite a bit of the sprue stub is still left on here. So taking my cutter, I cut it as closely as I can. And as you can see, that's a pretty nice clean cut there. So I'm going to do that on the other parts as well. Throw the little bits in the trash can. And then on the front here, okay, so that's cutting them pretty close and pretty cleanly, so I shouldn't really have to do any sanding on that, especially right now. So there it is. Those are all nice and cleaned up. So first thing I want to do before I get into the painting or anything, because there is some interior painting we need to do first, is check the fit. So I'm going to line it up, and now as you can see right here on this seam, there's a little bit of wiggle room, okay, and that is not a bad thing. I kind of like that in that it allows, even with the locating pins, it allows some room to get the parts put together and then slide them around till they're lined up just perfectly, so they fit together real nicely. Okay, now it got a bit of a gap right there, but when you squeeze it up like this. So when it comes to painting, I'm going to show you how I handle painting or gluing fuselages together to minimize the cleanup, because if I were just to stick it together like this right now, I might have a gap here, because even squeezing on the sides, it increases rather than lessens that seam. So I'll show you how I'll deal with that. But anyway, first thing we need to do after those parts are cleaned up is I have to mix up some paint for the inside of the fuselage here. And those are going to be XF3 and XF5. Those are the two colors we need to make the interior green for this kit. Now, you could, if you don't want to mix paints, you could find an equivalent that kind of matches that in other brands of paint, or you might even opt to go with just a single color in the Tamiya paints, whatever, you know, you could opt to do that, and that's fine. I am going to stick with the instructions on this and do it just like as it shows. So I'm going to mix up XF3 and XF5 to create the color that we need. Alright, first thing I like to do when I'm going to do some painting is I get some cheap newsprint drawing pad paper and make myself a little kind of a protective cover for my work area. because I don't like getting paint on my cutting mat. I've got 2 things of water here. I've got my paint mixer, my colors, and I'm kind of cheating here, but I'll talk about it in a sec. I've got an eyedropper bottle. The eyedropper bottle is what I like to use for mixing colors that I'll be using from time to time. For example, RLM02, I mixed up some of this, so it's ready to go in the future if I ever need it for, say, a German aircraft. But in a case like this, I especially like to mix up my colors ahead of time. That way I'm not having to do this whole process over and over and over through the build, because we're going to be using this interior color later on after we do the fuselage. So this is just, you can buy these online, or if you use Vallejo paints and you've emptied any, keep those. You can clean them out and reuse them, and they're very, very handy. So got that. I've got my thinner, I've got my 2 colors, I've got 2 containers of water, which I'll show you why I have 2. I've already mixed the yellow, so let's go ahead and mix the green. Now the green, you can use just a paintbrush, or you can even shake the bottle if you want, anything like that. I prefer to do this because I don't like getting paint all around the outside of the edge of my bottles. But this right here, I've talked about them in other videos. You can buy these really inexpensively online. You can even make one if you have a Dremel tool or anything else, but you can also use, you know, any kind of stir type sticks. But I like to use these just for their ease of use. It mixes it up really well and quickly. Like that. Then I just tap off the excess, put it in here, clean it. Just make sure you don't go hitting that trigger before you have it in a safe spot, because you'll sling paint everywhere. All right, so my 2 colors are now mixed. So my ratio for the paint, as it calls for, is XF3 2 parts, XF5 1 part. So I'm going to be mixing up a bottle of it, so I'm going to do a bit more than that. I like to use these disposable droppers, and I mark them so I use the same amount every time, because the hash marks on here for the milliliters are kind of hard to see, so this just makes it a little bit easier. So let me show you how I do it. So let's see, let's do the yellow first, which is XF3, and it's 2 parts of this color. So I'm going to do 2 parts. So let's go one, fill it up to the line once, and twice. So that gives us the 2 parts of that color. Now here's where the water comes in. I've got 2 things of water here. One, to initially clean out my dropper, because even though these are really cheap for a big bag, I don't like to have to order stuff any more than I need to. So I do like a initial cleaning with the dirty water, and then with the clean water, clean it out the rest of the way. All right, so there we go. And don't worry about the very tiny bit of residual water. It won't hurt on Tamiya acrylics, because you can actually dilute this with water, like say distilled water or something. So don't worry about it. So we've got 2 parts of the yellow. Now we're going to do 1 part green. So we'll pull it up to the line there. And drop that in there. Okay, clean the dropper the same way. Wipe off the outside. And after they start getting a little cloudy looking on the inside and just not as clean as they used to be, then I chuck them and get a new one. But generally I just use one for a couple of projects, and then I clean it up. So that's pretty good. All right, so the next thing I want to add is thinner. And you don't want to try and use the paint right out of the jar, because it's a bit thick and just spray through an airbrush. So I do, for stuff like this, I try and do about at least 50-50. So I've put 3 droppers to the line, 1 milliliter of paint. Okay, so I'm going to at least do 3 of the thinner, because you want to build up your paint in layers. You don't want to flood it on there too much. Because it just sprays easier and it's easier to build it up. So let's see, you know what? So in this case, I'm going to add 1 more. And paint, it's kind of, for a lot of things, it's kind of personal preference. So you may find a mix of your own. So I would suggest experimenting. So put that on, put the lid on it. Shake it up real good. So after a bit of shaking, that's what I've got. All right, so there's the color. And then what I like to do as well is label what we've got here. So I don't know what the actual color number would be, because like on German colors, it's, you know, like that one I showed, it's an RLM 02 or whatever. But this one, I'm just going to put US interior green. Okay, you can get all fancy and find out what the RLM numbers and do an exact color match and all that kind of stuff, but this will get us by. So there's that. All right, so we're ready to go. Now remember, I mentioned in the last video that I like to use primer for everything. So in this case, since it's the interior color, and as you can see, you're not going to see much inside. We're not going to be doing any weathering or masking on the inside. I am opting not to use primer on the inside. And that just goes to show that you don't need to use primer all the time, although I do recommend it. But it's more important on the exterior, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and spray the inside of this. And I'm using the single action HPM2 that I mentioned. Got my paint here. Okay, and it will not take much. So I'm only going to put, I'm putting 4 drops in there. So I've got 4 drops. We'll see if that'll be enough to cover. I like to use my cap. Okay, open it up a little bit, spray it. Okay, there we go. So in looking at the instructions, looks like a little ways past the cockpit opening to this line right here, which probably mounts the firewall. So let's paint. And I'm not masking anything off. Sometimes I mask off depending on how much area there is. Sometimes I'll mask off where it's going to be glued later. But since these are flat spots, those will be easy to Those will be easy to just scrape off with a knife. Now, one other thing to think about is this windowsill right here where the cockpit canopy will be. I'm going to spray that as well as the inside right here and the inside right here, because that would all be green, this interior green. Now, some of you may notice that I have not filled in or taken care of these eject pin marks, and the reason I haven't is you're not going to see them. So I have not to do that. Okay, so we'll set that one aside. Let it dry for a few minutes while I do this one. And there you go. That was exactly the right amount of paint. We used every bit of it. So, real quick, I'll show you how easy it is to clean up your airbrush, so it'll be ready to go for the next color. I use lacquer thinner, and I use this little squeeze bottle, and I just squirt a little bit in there. And use my paint pot or some, trash can, whatever you want. Paint pot's pretty nice though. I just spray it out like that, kind of clear out so nothing dries up on the inside. I use an old brush, clean around in the bowl there. Spray out the inside, and there you have it. Now, that is not a way I would clean it if I was going to be finished with the model for a while, or it was going to be a while before I was painting again. I'd break it down and clean a little more, do a little bit more detailed cleaning, but no, not necessary in this case. So that's been done. So let me clear this off and we'll get back to it. All right, next up is just paint the details on the inside of the cockpit. So on this side we have XF1, which is flat black. In this case, I'm going to be using the Vallejo Model Air NATO black, just because it's pretty much ready to roll as far as squirt it out of the bottle and paint it. This little cup right here, I get these at the local, it's kind of a grocery store that specializes in food service kind of stuff. And you can buy a big giant bag of these for just a few bucks, and they're really great for painting, using for paint, weathering stuff, and everything else. Okay, just using my brush here. Very carefully. Paint these parts. Now, keeping in mind this is a beginner video, as you can see, if I were to try and paint this, I'm a little bit shaky, not too bad, but if you use fingers and surfaces to help steady yourself, makes it a lot easier to paint details. It's very simple, just paint them up. This particular brush right here is a 0, and the famous Shepherd Payne, look him up if you don't know who he is. He talked a lot about when painting, especially figures, support your fingers, support your hands, makes it a lot easier to paint. Now I'm going to paint these cables here. I'm not going to go all the way down because, again, you're not going to be able to really see inside of this cockpit, and I really don't want to mess it up. Now, so I'm just barely touching the raised detail to paint it, because it's real easy to get it messed up. So there we go. Those are painted. I'll clean my brush. Now the other side calls for khaki. And again, I'll be using, this time, Vallejo Model Color, because that's the brand I have in that color. So what I like to do with this, now you can do it one of two ways. You can either use the airbrush thinner, which I do frequently, or in this case, I think I'll use the distilled water. And the reason I'm using the distilled is because our water is really hard in this neighborhood, and I just think it seems to work just a little bit better. And no, you're really not supposed to use your paintbrush to mix colors, but you know what? I'm being careful, and as you can see, I haven't got it all the way up to the ferrule, so I can be excused. All right, same thing. So this side here, it calls for XF49, which is khaki in Tamiya. So I'm using khaki from Vallejo Model Color. These are a lot bigger, and they're a little easier to paint. Now, a lot of people like to use Vallejo paints for spraying. I don't, because I just don't have much luck with it, because it seems to skin over really quick in my airbrush in the cup, and I guess there's additives and stuff like that, and I've tried them to no avail, and so that's why I use Tamiya paints for my airbrush. But for brush painting, it works really well, because you can keep it, if it starts getting, most of the time with the stuff that we paint is small, so a little bit of paint is going to last. You know, you'll be able to do a paint job pretty quickly without having to worry about the paint drying up too quick. And if it does, you can just use a little bit more of your water or thinner and retarders or anything else you might be using to keep it at the proper viscosity to paint. So there's that. All right, so now I'm ready to assemble these two pieces. Now you'll notice that I have not painted that. That's because I'm going to wait till very late in the whole building process. So the first thing I want to do is where the parts are cemented together, I want to scrape the paint off. And the reason I do that is just to give it a nice clean bond. Now, will it glue together with the paint on there? Sure will. People do it all the time, including me if necessary. But given the choice, I like to keep a nice, clean, bare plastic surface to glue together. Then what I want to do is I want to take a look ahead here and see where the parts glue in of the cockpit and scrape any residual paint off of there as well. So in looking at it, it looks like part of it glues onto this little channel right here. So I'm gonna scrape the paint off of here. And here as well. It's probably not really necessary because this isn't going to be a part that's going to be stressed, and once it gets buttoned up inside, not only is the glue going to hold it, the cement, but just friction from it being inside of the fuselage will help it, as that will hold it in place as well. So I think that's pretty good. So let's see, let's make sure these are cleaned off really well. And you want to be careful that you don't scrape too much, because if you scrape too much, you risk creating a imperfection in the two fuselage halves where they glue together, and you want to try and avoid that. That's why when I scrape with my knife slightly, not this much, but slightly tilted this way. That way I can see where the paint is scraping off, and then gradually level it out to where I'm just barely touching this top edge, because that's where you want it to be really nice and smooth. For when you cement it together. So that's done. So let's take a look at how I'm going to glue this together. So the way I like to do fuselage halves is I like to use naturally occurring lengths of contact. So like for instance on this right here, you have this piece right here goes to here and then breaks because of the molding that goes around this part here that's on one side of the fuselage. So we have one strip there, then we have this here which breaks here. So this is one whole piece. Then this is a piece in here, this is a piece, this is a piece, which goes on around here, and then this piece here. So, and the reason I like to do that is it allows me to glue the parts together, hold it in place, get it lined up as closely as possible. That way later on when I have to do cleanup, I'm not eliminating a bunch of detail. Okay, because like I showed earlier, you got a little bit of wiggle room here, so you want to make sure that it fits together really well and lined up. Then once that part is dry, the cement is cured up, I can move on to the next part. And then that way if I have to clamp something later, it's not going to shift this other part because it's already dry. So let us begin. So the proper way, and this, people do this stuff a lot of different ways, but this is the way I find it works the best. With Tamiya Extra Thin, it's so thin that you want to allow capillary action to do most of the work for you. Okay, so what that means is you get your pieces together, might even allow just a little bit of gap, and you just touch it to the inside of the seam, and capillary action will draw it down through the seam. Okay, back here, just touch it right there, trying not to get too much on the surface, and it will pull that cement down through there, and then you can squeeze it together and hold it for a few seconds. Now if you get a little bead of plastic coming out of the joint where you've got the two pieces together, that's good because that gives you a little bit of material to sand down or scrape down to make it nice and even. And as it's curing up, you can realign it before it cures up all the way. And just hold it for a few seconds until it dries. All right, so with that done, next is to move on to this part here. Do the same thing. Make sure that's lined up as closely as possible. I'm just going to drop a little bit right down in there. Then move on to this one here. And we'll put some here and here. For that one, I think I will. I don't think I need to. I was going to put a clamp on it, but I don't think it's necessary. Hold that for a few minutes. And then we'll go ahead and get some here. Push that together. Make sure that lines up pretty good. And then last, well not last, but for this part, some here. Nice thing is we can get that from the inside like that. And it's all going together really nicely. Make sure it's lined up. And hold that for a minute. All right, so with that part set up, then the next part is this here. Now this one, remember, if you try and squeeze it like that, it's going to gap it apart. So it's going to take some pressure from up on high here. So what we'll do is put some cement there, and then put some inside like that, and then while pulling out on this and pushing in on the top, line it up as closely as possible, because what we want to do is avoid having to do too much scraping and sanding, possibly obliterating some of the rivet and panel line detail. But if we do, there's a way to fix it, so no big deal. So we'll kind of hold on to that one for a few seconds. And that will take care of the fuselage for now. So the next part of step 1 is to install the horizontal stabilizers and the rudder. However, we're going to hold off on that for a few minutes because we want to let this cure up really good, and then we'll start taking care of some of these seams and stuff before we start gluing that on. But in the meantime, we can cut them off and get them cleaned up. So we'll let that dry for a few minutes, and we'll cut those parts off so we can get them cleaned up. There we go. And some people like to cut real close right off the sprue, and that's fine. I just don't do it that way, but that's just because of preference. But you do want to be careful when you're doing parts like this. So like in a case like this, the sprue gate, the attachment point is on this surface here as opposed to this surface, because as you can see where the mold line right here, this is on that side of it. So on a curved surface like this, I like to kind of cut it at an angle, and then that way it leaves you a little bit to sand off instead of cutting a divot into that curved surface. Hopefully that's the theory behind it anyway. And then just take a sander and sand that smooth. Now you can see white there, it's kind of discolored, but that's because of the plastic being stressed as it's cut. And then just using the sander, just kind of hit the edge there, kind of going back and forth, and that will take care of any seam line. You might not be able to see it right now, but once you get primer on it and or paint, then you're going to see it. So you can see where the parting line is of the molds. When I started sanding it, that little sliver came off, and that's what you want. Alright, so this has been all cleaned up as good as I can tell without having any primer or anything on it. Sometimes you can tell because it'll be kind of whitish looking along the edge from a part that's kind of buzzed up. But anyway, that's clean. One real quick thing before I start cleaning this up that's nice about Tamiya kits, or at least this one, but the engineering is such that there's no mistaking which way these go, and there's also no problem with having, making sure that these are perpendicular to the tail, because it's one piece. It's got a notch on one side that matches a notch. It's deeper on this side than it is this side, so it'll only go on one way, and it's really snug, and you don't have to worry about any filling or any of that kind of stuff. But anyway, we'll get back to that after we get this cleaned up. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to kind of hit it with the knife a little bit and see if I can get it cleaned up that way without having to do a lot of sanding. Because even though the blade is flat, if you keep it moving like side to side, you can get it cleaned up just like that. That's nice and smooth. Should be. Now we'll hit it with a little bit of sanding just to make sure, but that way you're not using a big old sander and obliterating some of this detail, because there's rivets. I don't know if you can see it, but there's rivets all along here. And you want to try and avoid sanding those off. or scraping them off. So we'll do that, and then taking this narrow sander and using a kind of a back and forth rocking motion like that, we can make sure it's got a nice curved surface with no flat spots. Now right here is kind of a circular bit of detail, and you want to be careful with that as well, because that might be kind of tricky to get cleaned up. But if you have a good blade, you'll be fine as far as getting that cleaned up. And being on the bottom of the aircraft, and this is kind of a cop-out, I know, but being on the bottom of the aircraft, you're not going to notice it as much anyway, because generally it's going to be sitting on the landing gear, and you're not going to see the underneath as much. But it's not really an excuse to avoid cleaning it up. It's just, you know, especially for beginners, when some of this stuff can be a little frustrating, you know, it'll be okay. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm not going to do every single one and make you watch. This is one of those cases where it's just going to be doing the same thing over and over on each one of these seams in between these panel lines. So I'll go ahead and get those cleaned up and not make you watch all of it. And then I'll come back and we'll talk about the panel lines and any cleanup we might need to do on that. Okay, so I've got it all cleaned up, and now need to take a look at the panel lines. So underneath, it's pretty easy. It's just a matter, just take your blade, or any blade, and using the back side of the blade, not the front, just carefully go from one side to the other and just kind of clean that line out. Unless you really sand it really hard, you're not going to remove the panel line, but you may fill it up with some plastic and, you know, dust, and maybe shallow it up a bit. But there you can see they're all pretty well defined still. It's just a matter of being careful with the sanding and then coming back and cleaning it up. So same thing up here. Do it right here. Okay, then you're going to run into some spots possibly like this. Right here, some really faint and shallow panel lines. So because it's pretty well gone, it's not going to be just a matter of dragging it across. You could risk making it crooked. So just using a piece of thicker tape, I'm just going to put it along the edge like this, making sure that it's right at the edge of the panel line, and then smash it down really good. Then very lightly starting, very easy light passes until the groove gets going. Just keep going over it, keep going over it. You'll see a little bit of material coming out, a little bit of the plastic like that. And then you've repaired that panel line. And you'll notice it a lot more when you get primer and paint on it. Okay, so that's been repaired. This one was easy, just going across like that. So now the only other thing is on the spine right here, and you can see it in this illustration, there should be two lines here and here. So again, there was no way to get around it because they were really faint to begin with. So, and just eyeballing it, put your tape on there, and then doing the same thing. Very lightly begin from this panel line here to this panel line, as you can see it in this illustration here. That's one thing about Tamiya illustrations. They're generally really good about showing the detail and how it should look. And just carefully without applying too much pressure and keeping it butted up against the tape. Score it. I'm not going to go real deep because I think they're pretty faint to begin with, because I could barely see them when I was sanding. You got to be careful because it's going to be tough. But see, there you go. And then I'm going to get a fresh piece of tape. Just make sure that whatever knife you use has a good tip on it, so it doesn't wander and it cuts without having to use a lot of pressure. And then just kind of eyeball it again. Get it as close as you can so it matches and it's kind of symmetrical. Really press it down, and then do the same thing here. Just gently rest it up against the tape, drag it down. That one's giving some problems, so I'm going to use this other blade here. Now there are other things better than masking tape to do this with, and I'll get into that someday, but I don't have any of it on hand. And there you go. It's back in place. And who knows, after primer and paint, you might not even be able to see it. But at least it's there. Try and clean it out just a little bit. And there's that. All right. So now that the cleanup is taken care of, another trick is, if you really want to make sure it's cleaned up good, use a little bit of I'm just going to use some thinner here because it's alcohol based, and a cotton swab. And just rub it on there, and that'll clean up any residual plastic. Sometimes you can use Tamiya extra thin cement, but this is kind of fine and I really don't want to risk that. Okay, there you go. So that's all done. So now all I have to do is install the tail parts. What I'm going to do is, I've got it almost in a place, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply some extra thin there underneath, and when I slide it into place, the cement will be in there. Okay, just like that. And then doing the same thing on here as far as cleaning it up. This inside part really isn't quite as necessary, but I just like to do it anyhow to get the parting line taken care of. should be good to go with that. So let's put that in place here. And it's good. So we'll get a little bit of, now in this case I'm going to use this cement because it'll work a little easier. Just put a little dab. Top and bottom there. Top and bottom there. And put that in place. Make sure it's pushed in there right. And there's that. So that right there takes care of step one. So step one is complete. Everything except for painting the tail wheel, which we will do later in the build process. So with that, I am going to call this video quits with step one, so it doesn't drag on any longer than it already is. Next time we come back, we will start on step two, which is the cockpit. So, as always, thank you for joining me here on Plastic Models by a Regular Dude and the Back to Basics project, the Tamiya F4F-4 in 1/48 scale. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything about the process going on here, please put them in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So until next time, in step two, I will see you all later.